Prior to World War II, both Hitler and Mussolini were boasting about their military forces to each other. Mussolini announced in 1934 that he can mobilize 6 million soldiers. In 1936 he increased the number to 8 million, and in 1939 to 12 million. If those numbers sound a bit off, well, Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in history, and it was conducted by around 4 million soldiers. Nevertheless, the Italians managed to mobilize around 3 million soldiers in total, yet these soldiers were basically worse equipped than the Italian troops in World War I. Quite in contrast to the German and Japanese forces, the Italian forces were not ready for a war against any major force. The question remains why the Italian armed forces were not ready for a war. There are several reasons for this. In general, the Italian and fascist system was quite inefficient. First, Italy had a limited amount of industries, which weren't properly prepared for arms production. Second, the allocation of resources and organization was limited. Additionally, similar to Germany and Japan, Italy also had a severe lack of resources. Third, the wars in Ethiopia and Spain required resources that the Italians couldn't spare. After all, those conflicts dragged on for far longer than anticipated. As a result, the Italian forces were not ready when the war in 1939 started. Mussolini was quite aware of this problem. After all, he insisted on a period of peace during the negotiations of the Pact of Steel, the so-called Stahlpakt, with Germany, and didn't join the war until 1940 by declaring a war on France. At first, some information about the general organization of the Italian army before the war. Like other countries, Italy drew lessons from the war in Spain and Ethiopia. Yet the forces were still in reorganization when the Second World War started, and the industry couldn't match the requirements for the required motorization or even basic equipment that was needed. In 1937, the Italian army restructured its divisions from the common system of tripartite to a bipartite system, the so-called binary system, where each infantry division only consists of 2 infantry regiments instead of 3, something that is also portrayed in Hearts of Iron III and Hearts of Iron IV, as you can see here from the division builder of an Italian division in 1939 and the British division in 1939. But be aware though that the Hearts of Iron IV basic division layouts lack artillery regiments. Furthermore, the so-called support companies historically usually were battalions, as you can see here with a basic infantry division layout from 1940. Yet, from a game design perspective, it makes sense to call them companies, because you can't mix them up with your regular battalions when writing about your division composition on the forums. Anyway, if you want to learn more about unit organizations, check out the playlist on my various organization videos. Now, the intention of the binary system was to make the units more capable for mobile warfare. The units should be easier to command and be more mobile. The lack in manpower should be countered with modern equipment. Yet this was wishful thinking because the Italian industry couldn't even provide basic equipment in sufficient numbers. On the outside, the binary system created more divisions, but basically this was only useful for propaganda, and it didn't increase the capabilities of the Italian army. Next up is a brief look at the situation in 1939, and then a more detailed look at the state in June 1940. Let's look at the state of the Italian force in the beginning of the war in September 1939, when Italy was still at peace. In short, the situation of the Italian armed forces in September 1939 was abysmal. Let's begin with the army. It had 67 divisions without the units in Ethiopia. These divisions consist of 43 infantry divisions, 3 tank divisions, 2 motorized divisions, 3 fast divisions, 5 Alpini mountain divisions, and 11 other divisions for special purposes. Yet only 16 of these divisions were completely restructured. Furthermore, there was a lack of artillery, tanks, transport vehicles, anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns. Even basic supplies like quality food was lacking, so basically the army had a severe lack of almost everything. The navy was better equipped in terms of basic supplies like food and ammo, but it also lacked anti-aircraft capabilities on its ships and in its harbors. Yet there was a severe lack of fuel. Still, in comparison with the other branches, the navy was the best equipped and prepared. The Italian Air Force, the so-called Regia Aeronautica, also had major problems. There was a vast amount of different aircraft types, and additionally the ground crews were of limited quality. This led to a number of operational aircraft of less than 50% in September 1939, when only 1,200 planes were operational out of a total of around 2,600. Furthermore, most aircraft were usually underpowered and underarmed. As a result of the dire state of the armed forces and the arms industry, the Ministry for War Production in December 1939 advised Mussolini that only an army of 73 divisions would be feasible, instead of the originally planned number of 126. Yet still the industry wasn't capable in equipping those units sufficiently till the entry of Italy into the war in June 1940. But nobody assumed that Italy would enter the war that early. Well, seems like Mussolini had a tendency for premature declarations. Now, after the Italian declaration of war in June 1940, the situation was a bit different, but not much. Let's take a closer look. First, the army. In June 1940, Italy entered the war with a total of 73 divisions. Whereas in 1915 the Italian army joined the war with more men, it was also an army that had similar quality weapons and equipment like other majors. But in 1940 this was clearly not the case. Of the 73 divisions, only 19 had the required amount of personnel, equipment, weapons and transport capacity. Another 34 divisions were operational but lacked personnel and transport vehicles. The last 20 divisions lacked more than 50% of the personnel, a significant amount of equipment and 50% of its transport vehicles. The infantry formed the mainstay of the Italian army, but the firepower of an Italian infantry division was, according to Gerhard Schreiber, only about 25% of a French infantry division and only around 10% of a German infantry division. Now, I don't know how the author determined those numbers, but here's a direct comparison on the numbers of an Italian and a German infantry division with the intended equipment and personnel. The Italian division had around 450 officers, whereas the German had around 500. In terms of NCOs, the Italian division only had around 600, whereas the Germans had almost 2,600. The number of enlisted men for the Italian division was around 12,000 men, whereas the Germans had almost 14,000 men. Now, in terms of heavy artillery, the Germans had 12 15 cm howitzers and 6 heavy infantry support guns with 15 cm of caliber. The Italians only had 12 100 mm howitzers, whereas the Germans had 36 105 mm howitzers. Furthermore, the Italians had 24 75 mm guns, whereas the Germans only had 20 infantry support guns with same caliber. The Italian division was also equipped with 8 65 mm mountain guns and 8 47 mm anti-tank guns, whereas the Germans had 75 3.7 cm anti-tank guns. For anti-aircraft defense, the Italian division packed 8 20 mm anti-air guns, whereas the Germans used the heavy machine guns for this purpose. In terms of infantry support weapons, the Italian division had 30 81 mm mortars, whereas the Germans had 54. Additionally, the Italians packed 126 light mortars, whereas the Germans only had 84 light mortars. In terms of heavy machine guns, the Italians had 80 and the Germans 110. And in light machine guns, the Italians had 270 in their division, whereas the Germans had 425 light machine guns. Now, the most important differences here are the low number of NCOs in the Italian division, because the NCOs form the backbone of every army. Thus, a lack in leadership definitely didn't improve the overall quality of the mission. Furthermore, the biggest Italian gun was the 100 mm, and only 12 were assigned to the division, whereas the Germans had 3 times that amount and additionally 18 guns with a caliber of 150 mm. Now, the Italians had a wide variety of guns ranging from 75 mm to 20 mm, but almost all in low numbers and of various types. This is basically a logistical nightmare with limited firepower, especially in combination with the severe lack of transport capacity and weak industry. Also, in terms of infantry support weapons like mortars and machine guns, the Germans had an advantage. Based on that data, I assume the firepower difference was calculated based on how much shell weight each division could deliver for a specified amount of time. At first, you can spot a 1 to 10 difference here. But you need to consider the weight differences of the higher caliber guns. Let's take a look at the weight of the 150mm howitzer shell. It was about 50 kg, whereas the 105mm howitzer could only deliver a shell of around 15 kg. The shell weight and thus the resulting firepower can easily be missed if you only look at the caliber alone. Furthermore, this comparison assumes that the division was fully equipped with artillery, but Italy had a severe lack of modern artillery and anti-aircraft guns. It lacked about 15,000 modern artillery guns, and the industry could only put out less than 100 per month. This meant that the Italians had a limited amount of modern artillery, and since that wasn't bad enough, there was also a lack of armor. The situation with tanks wasn't much better, and those tanks were also to a large degree simple light tanks of limited combat capabilities. Furthermore, the Italian industry had a lack of resources. How dire the situation was can be best expressed with some numbers. These are the percentages on the Italian estimates for meeting the requirements of 1940. In terms of artillery, only 6% could be achieved. Small caliber armor only 25%, medium caliber armor 7%, armor for high caliber 10%, rifles only 35%, machine guns 10%, medium mortars 70%, armor for those mortars only 10%, about 42% for planes, 40% for engines, and bombs under 1000 kg only 40%. Now as you can see, everything is quite red here. Now the Italian Navy was by far the strongest part of the armed forces. For the Mediterranean, the numbers of the Italian fleet were quite considerable. Here is a comparison between the Italian, British and French fleets assigned to the Mediterranean. In terms of battleships, Italy had 4, whereas the United Kingdom had 5, and France also 5. In terms of aircraft carriers, Italy had none, the UK had 1, and France had also none. When it came to cruisers, Italy had 7, the UK 0, and France 7 stationed in the Mediterranean. In terms of light cruisers, the Italian had 12, the British 9, and the French 7. Now for smaller vessels like destroyers and torpedo boats, Italy had 125, the UK 35, and France 57. In terms of submarine, the Italian fleet had a huge amount of 113 submarines, whereas the British only had 12 submarines stationed in the Mediterranean and France 46. Note that 2 of these 4 Italian battleships weren't fully operational yet in June 1940. Also, due to the bad state of the Italian industries, these numbers can be a bit misleading from a strategic point of view, because the British had way better capabilities to construct new ships in contrast to the Italians. Thus, losses on the Italian side had a greater strategic impact. Furthermore, these numbers don't represent the quality of the ships, its crews, nor other important factors. Nevertheless, the Italian ships met the international standards, unlike the army units. Although there were some major problems. First, the lack of air coverage by land-based aircraft due to the range and insufficient coordination within the Air Force. Of course, a missing naval air arm was also a major flaw in the Italian armed forces structure. Second, the power plants of the ships had limited reliability, and there was a general lack of anti-aircraft weapons for the ships and the harbors. Third, the lack of radar on Italian ships had a crucial impact during the Battle of Matapan against the British. The Germans had their own radars, but only after the loss at Matapan the Germans informed the Italians about their radar and provided assistance. Now let's take a brief look at the Air Force. In June 1940, the Regia Aeronautica had around 1,800 operational planes and about 600 non-operational planes. Thus it clearly had a higher readiness ratio than in September 1939. The total number of planes is actually a little lower than in 1939. This is probably due to the fact that this number doesn't include training planes. Yet the major problem was the lack of proper naval aviation, which is quite problematic for a country that has quite an extensive coastline. Although Italy had some good airframe designs, it lacked mostly powerful engines. And also its production capabilities were not the best, to put it very mildly. Well, time for an international comparison. Schreiber writes about the output of the Italian aircraft industry the following. Italy achieved between 1940 and 1933 an average output per year that was slightly above the British monthly average of produced aircraft in 1933. To conclude, there's a strong tendency to give the Italian soldiers a better reputation for being cowards and unreliable, which certainly is influenced by the fact that in World War I the Italians turned against their former allies, the German and the Austro-Hungarian empires. Nevertheless, in World War II Italian soldiers fought as brave as their allies and foes, thus there's no reason for the continuous disrespect about their combat capabilities, which is mostly a result of the poor state of their industry, weaponry and supply situation. As said before, all soldiers that served in war deserve our respect, even if we don't share their side or views. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share and subscribe. And see you next time.